We begin with big changes to President Trump's cabinet today. The president named a permanent replacement for the embattled Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
I want to confirm that Bill Barr, one of the most respected jurists in the country, highly respected lawyer, former Attorney General under the Bush administration, he will be nominated for the United States Attorney General.
Barr, currently working as an attorney at a private law firm, served as President George H.W. Bush's Attorney General in the early 1990s. I just mentioned this to Ali. What stands out there to me is President Trump has been anti having anyone from sort of old establishment, definitely who worked in the Bush or Bush administrations.
And look at that. He served in the CIA from 73 to 77. This guy's what Trump would normally refer to as the deep state.
Without a doubt. He was confirmed by voice vote in a democratically controlled Senate that included Al Gore, Joe Biden, and John Kerry. Barr previously served in the Justice Department and the CIA, and perhaps one reason why the president is so supportive, Barr authored an op-ed last year backing the president's decision to fire former FBI Director Jim Comey, a firing some view as obstruction of justice. But the new Attorney General nominee does not pass judgment on the Russia investigation, and I think that is super important.
Right.
It's one of the reasons you might see him get some bipartisan support.
Instead, Barr has said that Comey acted improperly in his July and October press conferences about the Clinton administration. These were in 2016. Barr wrote other op-eds, one defending the president's firing of acting Attorney General Sally Yates in 2017, saying, quote, Yates had no authority and no conceivable justification for directing the department's lawyers not to advocate the president's position in court.
And another in 2016 arguing that Jim Comey had no choice but to issue his October statement that he had reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton. Here's a bit of the president's nominee on political issues. In his words,
if someone wants to say there's no right to coercive interrogation, I disagree with that as a moral matter, but I haven't heard the critics say that. Now, if you can use coercion interrogation, the question is where you draw the line. And this administration says they're not going to engage in torture, but they will engage in coercive interrogation. And I'm not sure it would be helpful for Congress to try to figure out exactly what constitutes torture and what's coercion under the circumstances.
I do not believe the right to privacy extends to abortion, so I think that my views are consistent with the views that have been taken by the department since 1983, which is that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided and should be overruled.
We have to have aggressive steps to suppress the criminals of today who are wreaking havoc today on the streets. And at the same time, we do need programs to prevent as best we can the youth of today from becoming the criminals of tomorrow. However, I think too many advocates of the root causes approach fail to appreciate the vital need for vigorous law enforcement.
All right, let's talk about this guy, William Barr. Joining us now, NBC News Justice Correspondent Pete Williams and former compliance counsel expert at the Justice Department, Chen. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. Pete, as Stephanie said, William Barr breezed through his confirmation in 1991, unanimously reported out of the committee, confirmed by a voice vote by a Senate that was controlled by Democrats about a month after that. Is this going to be as easy for him this time?
No, I don't think so, because, of course, the number one question for anybody nominated to be Attorney General can be summarized in one word: Mueller. So he's going to be asked how, he's clearly not going to have to, I assume clearly, from everything we know, there's no reason he'd have to recuse himself from running the Mueller investigation or overseeing it. He doesn't, unlike Jeff Sessions, for example, he didn't campaign for the president. The president said today he only met Bill Barr just recently. But the number one question at the confirmation is, what's your attitude going to be? Are you going to let Mueller do his thing? What are you going to do when the report comes out? So there'll be lots and lots of questions about that, in addition to all the other things that any Attorney General nominee would hear.
Wei, you worked for former Attorney General Barr. What is your sense of him? And is this guy up for getting a second act as the top of the DOJ?
So interestingly, I worked for him and Mueller at the same time. So Robert Mueller was the head of the criminal division when Bill Barr was the Attorney General.
So do they know each other well?
They had to. They had to be working together on a daily basis. They definitely have had a working relationship together. And my impression of Bill Barr is that, yes, he absolutely has very conservative credentials. He actually went to law school at night when he was at CIA.
Wow.
And got his law school degree while he was working at the CIA, where he met Bush Sr. And in the department, though, I think he's respected, at least, in my time there, my impression is this is a guy who's thoughtful. He has his conservative credentials. He has his agenda. However, he is someone who actually will follow law and will follow facts. That's certainly been my impression of him and his reputation.
This is a tricky one because everybody who has any history and track record and has spoken about the Russia investigation now has to be looked at in that light. How does the fact that he's got opinions on that affect him?
Well, I think, it's hard to get someone who has not expressed an opinion. And I think the key is really to watch what they do and watch their pattern of behavior in the past. And is this someone who's actually going to do what he's supposed to be doing in terms of actually executing his duties as the Attorney General of the United States?
I know you can't get inside of his head, and this question, I guess, is a bit about ethics and independence. Time and again, we hear from people in the administration who have left the administration that President Trump is looking for extreme loyalty. It's the reason he didn't like Jeff Sessions or he turned on him. How much of an independent thinker is Barr? I mean, I'm thinking even in the last 24 hours, the comments that we heard from Rex Tillerson, how he would normally go head-to-head with the president, and the president wouldn't have a basic understanding of what he was legally allowed to do. Barr is putting himself in a very precarious job.
Absolutely, just like Christopher Wray at the FBI as well.
And I'm not sure if Christopher Wray would take that job today. That's why I ask.
Yeah, I think the reputation that Barr has is one that's actually very respected. And so I have no reason to think that he would be someone who would be pledging eternal loyalty to Trump. Now, what did he have to do to actually get the nomination? We don't know.
Pete,
where there were promises made.
That's interesting.
What are you hearing, Pete, from the Justice Department, from people you're talking to?
Some relief, I think. Remember, it's been 25 years since he was Attorney General, so there's 1 or 2 generations away from people who worked with him then. So he's a stranger to many of the people at the Justice Department now. But I think people at the Justice Department look for the Attorney General to advocate for the institution rather than for the person that put them there. And I think there's a great deal of confidence that Barr understands the institutional importance of maintaining the Justice Department's mission. So I think there's some relief and some optimism there. The Matt Whitaker appointment as acting Attorney General was clearly intended to be temporary. Now, under the law, Whitaker will continue to serve as acting Attorney General until a nominee is confirmed. And I would think that confirmation's not going to come until, what, maybe February, early February? So Matt Whitaker will be there another couple of months. But I think the reviews so far are good.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.